Welcome to the Humans of Nature podcast, where we delve into the untold stories of our planet's delicate ecosystem. We're your hosts, Ratambra,
And my name is Vasindra.
and we're thrilled to embark on this journey with you. So, we are here today with Dr. Mark Brigham at the University of Regina, who studies bird ecology and conservation, including the effects of climate change on migratory bird populations. Dr. Brigham has also conducted research on the conservation of endangered species like the burrowing owl and the greater sage grouse. Dr. Brigham, would you also like to add on a few words about yourself?
Sure. I guess I'm also fairly well known. I spend a lot of time studying bats as well. So the birds that you speak of, I've definitely studied, but I guess I'm a little bit better known for studying nocturnal birds, namely things called nightjars, nighthawks, and poorwills, and things like that. But I also do an awful lot of work on bats, much of it in an endangered species context, but not all. And I've also been a member of CSIWIC, which in Canada is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, which is a group of people who get together to decide the status of various species, whether or not they deserve to be endangered or threatened, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes, we did see that you worked with nightjars and bats while we were researching.
Yep.
So we will be asking questions about that.
Okay.
So let's start with our first question. So, as we commemorate World Endangered Day, could you share with us your journey into studying temperate insect-eating bats and goatsucker species, which are facing a range of challenges today?
I guess I sort of fell into it, to be very honest. I was introduced to bats on a field course when I was an undergraduate student, nearly 40 years ago. I took the course because it was at a time where I could get out of the summer job that I was doing. The person who instructed it was great fun. I've always been a fan of underdogs. I'm a Toronto Maple Leaf fan, and I had a good time and realized that there was lots to learn about these animals. So that's how I got first introduced to bats, and I've been interested in them ever since.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing your insight on that.
So we would like to follow that up with the impact of environmental challenges. Your lab studies how these organisms cope with environmental constraints such as cold, drought, and losses of habitat, and
Mm-hmm.
all these factors can contribute to species becoming endangered.
Yep.
Can you tell us more about how these environmental issues have affected these species and their populations?
Yeah, that's a very complex question because different animals respond to environmental challenges and constraints and things like that in different ways. And it's something that I'm interested in from a purely biological perspective. I guess I think of sage grouse that I studied about 20 years ago with a student who seemed incredibly sensitive to any small changes in the environment. I was thinking about this the other day. If you put a compressor station on the environment or on the landscape, sage grouse wouldn't go within 5 kilometers of it, whereas other grassland songbirds in the daytime we've studied actually will nest on the grounds of the compressor station. So the impacts on different animals is often very, very different, which it's make things difficult. But I guess from a bat and nightjar point of view, what they have in common is that they both depend largely on flying insects to eat. And there is lots of data to suggest that aerial insectivores, and we have better data for birds than bats, are a group that have declined dramatically over the past number of years. So that's nightjars and swallows and swifts and other birds that eat flying insects. It's harder to study populations of bats, but our sense is many of them are declining as well. And all of them have in common this thing that they eat flying insects. And thus it would appear that changes in the numbers and abundance and density of flying insects is having a real impact. From a bat point of view, the other two major constraints that bats in North America are facing these days is something called white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease that was imported by accident from Europe that has caused lots of mortality, albeit in only some species. And it's not something we can do anything about, just sort of monitor the outcome. And for migratory bats, wind turbines are providing a real issue in that migratory bats, as they migrate south in the fall, seem to be attracted to these things, and it kills many tens of thousands of them. I'm a strong proponent of wind turbines as a way to generate power. So we have to work out how to have wind turbines and do less damage to the bats. And I think we can get there for that. So flying insects, wind turbines, fungal diseases are just some of the constraints that these animals are facing, and trying to understand how we can help those animals cope with those things obviously is something that myself and my students have been involved with to a considerable extent.
Can we know more about the wind turbine?
So in North America, wind turbines, the three species that seem to be affected most are called red bats, hoary bats, and silver-haired bats, all three of which have just been declared as endangered species in Canada, principally because of the impact of wind turbines. And I say again, I want to be very clear. I'm not trying to say wind turbines are bad and that we shouldn't have them. I do not feel that way. But like anything, they have benefits and they have costs. And one cost is killing tens of thousands of these bats every year. And it would appear that the bats are actually attracted to the turbines. We think that if we turn them off for about 2 or 3 hours at dusk, especially when wind speeds are fairly low, over a period of about 6 weeks in the fall, that we will reduce the fatalities to bats quite considerably, probably by maybe 75 or 80% is the estimation. Now, that comes at a cost, because if you turn them off, they're not generating electricity, and that means that the companies that build them aren't making any money on them. And so there is a trade-off. How important is not killing bats versus generating electricity? But the evidence suggests that if we keep killing bats at the rate we are, these three species are going to be in very deep trouble. So it's a delicate and difficult issue, but biologists can hopefully help by seeing whether there's other ways that we can do things to prevent bats from being killed by them. But at least for now, turning them off seems to be the best way.
Thank you for expanding on that point. We wouldn't expect the bats to be attracted to the turbines like that.
We didn't either, but what's really neat is that I've also studied nighthawks, these nocturnal insectivorous birds, which are also migratory. And interestingly, they don't get killed at wind turbines. So it doesn't pose them any problem at all. And we don't know the reason for that, but it's an interesting difference between the two groups.
All right. The fungal disease is also a very interesting point. We
Mhm.
could actually follow that question on with what practical steps do you believe individuals, communities, and policymakers can take to help preserve these species in their habitats and reduce their risk of being endangered?
Well, I think in a big, broad picture, humans just have to be more responsible for their actions and understand that many of the things we do, whether we do it on purpose or not, are impacting all sorts of animals and plants and all those sorts of things. And we just have to be more cognizant of the things we do. From a white nose syndrome point of view, I think it's really important that people involved in who are interested in caving and in caving associations, to the best of my knowledge, have been really good about limiting their activities in caves during the winter, which will reduce the disturbance to bats, but also making sure that if they go between caves, they seriously wash the clothing and all that sort of stuff that they're using, so that none of the fungal spores are moved from one place to another. As biologists, we make sure that after we use mist nets to catch bats in one place, we disinfect them to make sure that there's no fungus left on the nets, so that we're not transmitting them from bat to bat to bat. We wear personal protective clothing, etc., to make sure that we don't move the fungus between bats. Those sorts of things we do, but we still need to find out more about how it's moved, the fungus that is, and how far, etc. So that's a research question that some of my students are involved with, that we can hopefully learn more about where bats go to hibernate, and therefore how the fungus might move around.
Yeah, these points are important to take into consideration as us as humans, we need to take responsibilities for our actions
Mhm.
that we don't
I, I,
straightforward.
I think it's important that we understand that everything that we do, and I'm not trying to say that we all have to live in a certain place and never do anything and never go anywhere and all those kinds of things. But we have to recognize that many of the things that we do have impacts that are not so good. I mean, I put it in context for myself. I love to play golf. And when you think about it, especially in the prairies, golf requires that we put fertilizer and water on a lot of golf courses. And so I'd like to encourage golf courses to minimize how much water they use and how much fertilizer they use, and minimize pesticide use, and leave lots of places on the golf course with native vegetation, so that there we can have I can play golf. I'm being selfish, but we can minimize and reduce the impact that golf courses have on our environment. And I think we all have to think like that about everything we do. So if you have to go just a few 100 meters to the grocery store to get food, all right, walk there, take a knapsack and carry some stuff home, or ride your bike once in a while. We don't always have to take cars everywhere. We should think about using public transit more. I mean, there's all kinds of little things that we do. I'm old enough to know that when I was your age, there was no such thing as recycling. There was no such thing as composting. People didn't do that stuff. And look at how far we've come in those things, that because individuals have done things that help. And we just have to think of more things to do that minimize our impact on what's around us, because that we need this place to be healthy for us as well as all the other things.
Yeah, pollution seems like a really big problem for like habitat loss.
Hmm.
There's been-
Yeah, but it's not a simple, and I think sometimes we who are really interested in our natural environment try to portray it as too simple of a problem. You can think of, okay, uh, many of the bats that I study require trees either to live in or live on. That's where they spend their days. So you immediately think, okay, cutting down trees is bad because we're removing habitat for bats. But at the same time, wood is something that is a recyclable resource that we need for a variety of things. So how can we cut down trees in a responsible way to make use of that resource, but leave some at the same time, so that animals of all different kinds that require them have a place to live? And that's a challenging thing to do, but I'd like to think that with some consideration and thought, that humans are bright enough that we can do it.
Yeah, I agree as well. So, can you share some insights from your current projects that directly relate to the conservation of these species? Like, for instance, what have you learned from studying the response to distress calls by bats or impacts of grazing on the grassland birds?
So I'll do the grassland bird one, because I think it's very cool. So aside from aerial insectivores, the other group of birds that seem to be declining really, really rapidly are what are called grassland birds. And I think a big reason for that is that grasslands all over the world are perfectly suitable for agriculture. And if you turn a native grassland into a place where you grow all kinds of wheat, obviously it's not much good for the birds that used to live in the grassland. But if we're going to grow food to feed people, we need to grow wheat, and it's got to be done somewhere, and grasslands are a good place to do it. So we have to conserve some grassland for birds, and the best way to conserve that grassland is to have it used for other things as well. And And cattle grazing is a fine use of that grassland if it's done responsibly and it's not grazed by too many cows so that there's basically no grass left. And grass evolved with grazing. I mean, in Western Canada, bison used to live here. So if we can mimic in some ways the way bison grazed grass and do that in a responsible way, the thought would be that grassland birds should do quite well in those places. So I have a student that has spent the last couple of years studying how well grassland birds are doing in places where grazing happens versus where it doesn't happen. And we hope to ultimately compare it also to what happens when you hay those grasslands. So rather than letting cows graze through time, if you just let it grow and then cut it all down and keep all that grass as hay to feed animals later. And the suggestion we have is that, in fact, if you graze responsibly, the birds actually do quite well, although some species do better than others, and that makes it more complicated. But it's difficult to work out the costs and benefits of grazing versus not grazing versus haying versus not haying, all those things. And it's complicated, but that's what sort of doing research in biology is all about.
Of course, thank you. That was very thought-provoking. And thank you for sharing your insights on that. But this also leads into urbanization, as it's often a factor that leads to species endangerment.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the wildlife use of urban areas influence the survival of bats and goatsuckers, for example? And how does this compare to their existence in more natural environments?
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess what comes to mind first for me is we also have to think of things historically. So I'll use the common nighthawk as an example. So in cities, we tend to think of, for most animals, that cities are bad. And for a number of species, that's the case. But again, things are not black and white. There's lots of animals that actually do really, really well in cities. They live well next to humans. And for a long time, common nighthawks were one of those animals. And the reason was that historically we used to build lots of buildings with flat roofs, and we put gravel on top of tar on top of those roofs. And common nighthawks loved gravel roofs as a place to nest, and they did really, really well. And therefore, it was really common to see common nighthawks using gravel roofs on buildings in cities, and they would fly around. And especially when we put some lights up around sports stadiums, which attracts insects, the birds would fly through the lights in the stadium, collect insects, and they do really well. Through time, humans got better at making roofs, and they learned ways to make roofs that didn't involve gravel on flat roofs. So the roofs of buildings in cities have changed over the past number of decades, and trying to find a flat gravel roof now is much, much more difficult. And lo and behold, the number of nighthawks in cities has thus declined a whole lot. And it was one reason that I think nighthawks were declared threatened by Kasiwik. Because people weren't seeing them in cities before. I would argue, although we don't have the data to actually prove it, that nighthawks probably weren't that common in the places where we built cities because there wasn't an appropriate place for them to nest. They're very common still in the northern boreal forest of Canada, especially where we do some logging or there's a forest fire, because they like open places. So all the fires that are happening right now in Alberta and Saskatchewan are going to provide fabulous places for common nighthawks to nest next year. Does that mean we should burn down forest and do all kinds of logging? Well, remember, again, there's this trade-off. It's really good for nighthawks that there's these open places, but it's not so good for animals that need those forested places in which to live. So that's where forest fires happen. So they're not all bad. Some logging for human use should happen. So they're not all bad, but it's not cut down everything or burn down everything. So there's an example of how what we did in a city actually attracted some animals. And then when we changed our practices, not for bad or reasons, but then it impacted the animals in the reverse way. So I think in cities, we have to think about how can we have cities with people being comfortable, but do things to make them more useful and better habitat for animals that are around. And I think doing this will also make our lives better, because isn't it fun to be able to go outside and see animals and birds and plants and things like that right next to where we live? So I think there's benefits for us as well as the animals and plants that are involved.
Yeah, because there's a lot of misconceptions about how animals, well, in this case, like bats, shouldn't be living in like human spaces, like urban spaces, because it's not an ideal space for animals to live in. But I guess there's some advantages to that too, as you said, that they use like gravel roofs as a
Right.
habitat.
Well, bats are different, and I say it's the reason I was attracted to them, because most people don't like bats because they're associated with all sorts of myths and legends. And for many people, they're scary. They're viewed as ugly and threatening and all those sorts of things. And I could go on ad nauseum that most things people think about bats are in fact wrong. At the same time, if we build a house and 50 bats move into the attic, I can understand why someone isn't particularly thrilled by that, because we build houses for us, not to share with other animals unless we choose to do that. So again, how can we have this balance between places for the wildlife to live and places for us to enjoy? So I would argue, so if we have trees and we put up some bat houses, and the bats have a place to live, then they're going to eat the insects that are around that we often don't like, and everybody's going to be happy, except the insects, of course. So we just need to think about those things and also educate ourselves and help educate others, like you're doing right now with doing this podcast, about how all animals can have benefits and downsides that we have to think about in reasonable ways.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of that fact. So,
Well, but it's all of everything in life. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, okay, if I need a new car, should I buy an electric car? Well, it's going to be a whole lot more expensive. That's a downside. I got to find places to charge it. That's a downside. But I'm going to burn a whole lot less fossil fuel, and that's going to put a lot less carbon in the air. That's a good side. But then I have to think more sort of subtly. Where's the electricity coming from that I'm charging my electric car with? Well, in Saskatchewan, a lot of it comes from coal-fired generating plants. And that means instead of me burning fossil fuels to generate carbon, the generating plants are burning fossil fuels to generate carbon. Is there any real difference to that? You got to be careful not to think, I'm driving an electric car, I'm having no impact on the environment. Well, there's still all kinds of metal in that car and rubber in that car and all sorts of things that cause impacts. And where's the electricity come to charge it? What I'm trying to say is things are not black and white. They're complicated, and one needs to think about it and understand the impacts of the choices that we're making. And say it kind of pains me and kind of makes it hard every time I go and play golf to realize that I'm making a choice that it is definitely having an impact on the environment.
yeah. So, we would like to follow that up with like a personal like reflection segment.
Okay.
So can you share a memorable experience from your career studying bats and nightjars, especially one that highlights the challenges that these species face as they become increasingly endangered?
Hmm. I guess a recent one that's really quite cool is how these animals can be very surprising. So we've been catching hoary bats and silver-haired bats at our field station in the Cypress Hills in southwestern Saskatchewan for 20 plus years. And given the impacts of wind turbines, knowing that they kill a lot of these animals, we took great pains to try to put together all the data we'd collected over a long period of time, fully expecting to see a decline in the numbers of those bats that we caught on an annual basis. We expected, well, if so many are being killed at wind turbines, we should see a decline in numbers. And in fact, the data that we have suggests that for this one place at the Cypress Hills, we can detect no decline in the numbers of bats at all. And this was somewhat disturbing because the scientists in us thought, well, why aren't we finding a decline when so many tens of thousands of them are getting killed? And so it's hard to square the data that we have, which shows no decline, with what we know to be true, tens of thousands are getting killed, leaving us with a conclusion that, well, the Cypress Hills must be a really good place that attracts these animals. And when some get killed, other individuals are attracted to use the place. But it also made us quite nervous because we found data that could be used to say that, oh, there's no impact of wind turbines. It doesn't matter. We can keep going the way we are because you show that there's no decline. So it's a situation where the scientist has to try to explain data that don't quite square with what you think is going to happen. And that caused a dilemma in our minds from a conservation point of view. But at the same time, as a scientist, you have to pay attention to the data you collect and what might be going on and how might what you find sort of relate to the things that are going on at the broader scale. So it was a really a very large academic and personal challenge at the same time.
Yeah, it must have been hard, like knowing that there's a decline in the species, but you don't have like the reason for it.
Absolutely. But at the same time, you can't, as a scientist, as a thoughtful scientist, hide that or downplay it or dismiss it or anything like that. You have to try to explain it. And that's a difficult scientific challenge, but you have to be careful not to let your personal views on the conservation status of the animal interfere with your interpretation of that information.
Yeah, we're glad that you brought that up. It's an important aspect that we actually haven't considered.
Yeah.
And it expands on the conservation in a meaningful way.
Yes.
And
yes.
For conclusion and outlook, as we reflect on World Endangered Day, could you share your hopes for the future of bats and goatsuckers and what steps we can take to ensure their survival and remove them from the endangered species list?
I think the biggest thing that we can do as people is acknowledge that mosquitoes and other insects that sometimes bother us have every right to be here as well. And instead of getting out the can of repellent and trying to kill everything to make our lives perfectly comfortable, recognize that slapping a few of these once in a while is not the biggest deal, and let the bats do their job to reduce those insect numbers rather than feeling that we have to intervene and try to do something like chemicals to do that job. And I think if we thought about that a little bit more, then many of these other animals would probably have a little easier time of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much.
My great pleasure.
Yeah, and that brings us to the end of another episode of the Humans of Nature podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today and being a part of this incredible journey.
And before we go, we want to express our deepest gratitude to you, Dr. Brigham, for being a part of this podcast. Your support, engagement, and willingness to contribute help make a positive impact on the topics discussed in our Humans of Nature podcast.
It was my pleasure, ladies. I thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.